My name is Nadia Ostrowski, and I was 31 years old the first time I skipped a grocery run so I could wire $900 to my sister's account before midnight. She told me it was for hospital bills. She told me the collection agency had already called twice that week. She said, "You're the only one who understands what I'm going through, Nadia. Mom and Dad are too old to handle this." And I believed her because I wanted to, because that is what you do when your sister is sick, or so you think she is. I didn't argue. I didn't ask for a payment plan or a copy of the bill. I moved the money and told myself that family doesn't keep receipts. What I didn't know, what I had no reason to suspect for 5 full years, was that there was a document sitting inside a branch office 40 minutes from my apartment that would change every single thing I thought I understood about my sister, my mother, and the word trust. What happened the afternoon that statement arrived in my inbox is the reason I'm sitting here talking to you right now. Welcome back to channel, where quiet people let the paperwork do the talking. If this is your first time here, hit subscribe, and if you've ever sent money to someone who never once said thank you, drop a comment. I read every one. Backstory / quiet competence / the anchor elder. The apartment I rented when I was 26 had one window that faced a brick wall and a radiator that clicked through the night like something alive inside it. I didn't mind. I had a job I was good at. I was a licensed medical coder for a regional hospital network in Columbus, Ohio, which meant I spent 8 hours a day translating diagnosis notes into billing language, and I was fast at it and I was accurate. And after 3 years, I was the person the newer coders came to when a claim didn't add up. I mentioned the job not to impress anyone, but because it matters later. I knew how medical billing worked. I knew what a valid invoice looked like, what a real collection notice contained, what a hospital's billing department was and was not allowed to say on a statement. I knew all of that. And for 5 years, I did not apply a single piece of that knowledge to my own family. That is the part one have had to sit with. I grew up in a mid-sized suburb of Cleveland, the kind of place where everyone knows your mother's maiden name and your business is only as private as your front porch allows. My parents, Gerald and Diane Ostrowski, were not wealthy. My father drove a delivery route for a regional grocery distributor for 22 years. My mother worked part-time at a dental office until her knees made standing difficult. They were not extravagant people. They clipped coupons. They kept a 7-year-old Buick in the driveway long past the point where anyone would have replaced it. They raised 2 daughters, my sister Petra, 4 years older than me, on a budget that left very little room for error, and they managed it with a kind of quiet dignity that I always admired. Petra was the daughter who stayed close. She lived 20 minutes from my parents in a rented house, spent most Sunday dinners at their table, and called my mother every other morning. I was the one who had moved away for work, 3 hours southeast by choice, for a job opportunity I'd spent 2 years working toward. This geographic fact became, over time, a kind of social accounting that my family conducted without ever naming it directly. Petra was present. I was not. And for a long time I accepted that framing and let it drive choices I should have examined more carefully. The first wire transfer happened in February, about 6 weeks after Petra called me crying. She told me she'd had a procedure, something involving her gallbladder. She said, though the details were vague in the way that medical details are when someone is embarrassed or overwhelmed. She said the insurance had been patchy that year because she'd switched jobs twice, and the billing department had already sent one notice. She said it was $1,100 and she didn't have it and she didn't want to put it on a card. She asked if I could help just this once. She sounded genuinely frightened. I said yes. I sent $900 immediately and told her I'd cover the rest next paycheck. She cried a little. She said I was the only one who actually showed up for her. She said she'd pay me back when her new benefits kicked in. The next call came 3 months later. Another procedure, she said. Something related, she thought. Maybe a follow-up. The number this time was 700. I sent 900 again, because I didn't want her to feel the difference. There was no third call that asked for a lump sum. It evolved more gradually than that, the way a temperature drops in a room when you're not watching the thermostat. By the following winter, I was sending $900 every month, automatically, into an account Petra had set up for what she called her medical holding fund. She explained it to me very reasonably. The bills came in irregular cycles, she said, and it was easier for her to have a cushion she could draw from rather than calling me every time in a panic. I thought that sounded practical. I set up the recurring transfer in my banking app on a Sunday evening and didn't think about it very much after that. My grandmother, Rosa, was 78 and lived in a small house in the same Cleveland suburb. She was my mother's mother, and she was not a woman who softened her observations out of politeness. She had come to the United States from Poland in her late 20s with her husband and 2 daughters and $40, and she had a way of looking at a situation that stripped away every layer of sentiment until you were left with just the structure of it. I drove up to see her 4 or 5 times a year, and those visits mattered to me in a way I find difficult to fully explain. She was the only person in my family who had ever asked me, point blank, what I actually wanted, not what I was doing for everyone else, but what I wanted. The visit I'm thinking of happened about 2.5 years into the transfers. I was 33, it was October, and Grandma Rosa was making cabbage soup and not looking at me while she talked, which was always the sign that she was about to say something real. "How much are you giving Petra?" she asked, without preamble. I told her, $900 a month, for the medical bills. She stirred the soup. She was quiet for a long moment. "Has she shown you the bills?" she asked. I said I hadn't asked to see them. It felt invasive, I said. She was family. Grandma Rosa turned around and looked at me with the expression of a woman who had seen too much of life to be tactful about it. She said, "You work in billing, Nadia. You know what a real bill looks like." I told her Petra was sick. I told her this was just what I was able to do. Grandma Rosa turned back to the stove. She said, very quietly, "I hope you are right." I drove home 3 hours later with her words sitting in the passenger seat beside me and did nothing about them for another 2 years. 2. The betrayal in full. The first moment I asked a direct question was not because I had grown suspicious. It was because of a practical problem. My own landlord had raised my rent by $220 a month starting in March, and I needed to look at my budget honestly and decide what I could absorb. I sat down with a notebook, I still do that, paper and pen, and I looked at what was going out and what was coming in, and I realized that $900 a month, multiplied by the number of months I'd been sending it, was a number I had never actually written down in one place. $54,000. That was the figure when I did the arithmetic. 60 months. $900 each. $54,000 that had left my account and entered my sister's medical holding fund over 5 years. I didn't panic when I saw the number. Something in my chest went very still, the way a room goes still just before a sound you don't expect. I had been so focused on each individual transfer, small enough, monthly enough, that it had never felt large, that I had never stood far enough back to see the total shape of what I'd given. I called Petra that evening. I kept my voice even. I told her I was doing a budget review and needed to get a clearer picture of where things stood. I asked if she could send me a summary of the medical accounts the fund had been going toward, just rough totals, I said, whatever she had on hand. There was a pause. Not long. Maybe 4 seconds. Then she said, "Why do you need that? Do you not trust me?" I said it wasn't about trust. I said, I just wanted to understand the overall picture. She said, "I've been managing this really carefully, Nadia. I've had a hard few years. I don't think I should have to justify every medical decision to you." I said I wasn't asking her to justify anything. I said I'd love to just see an invoice or 2, even old ones, just so I could close out the line in my own records. She was quiet again. Then she said, "I'll send you something when I have a chance. Things have been really stressful lately." I said okay. I thanked her. I ended the call. She never sent anything. I waited 3 weeks. I sent a follow-up text, friendly, low pressure. "Hey, no rush, just whenever you get a chance." She replied with a string of messages about a difficult week at work and ended with, "I'll dig up the paperwork. I just need some time." I waited another 2 weeks. I called my mother. I want to be careful about how I characterize this conversation because my mother is not a cruel woman. She is a woman who has always, as long as I can remember, oriented herself toward the child in the most visible pain, and for most of my adult life that child had been Petra. I don't think my mother knew, at that point, the full scope of what was happening. What I know is what she said. She said, "I think you should just let it go, Nadia. Petra's had a hard time with her health. Not everything has to be an audit." I said I wasn't trying to make it an audit. I said I had given $54,000 over 5 years, and I had never seen a single invoice. My mother was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "You've always had a different relationship with money than the rest of us.
Petra's not like that.
She doesn't think in spreadsheets." I said, "Mom, I work in medical billing. I know what a real bill looks like. I'm just asking to see one." My mother said, "I know you mean well, but the way you're going about this, Petra called me, and she's really hurt. She said you're making her feel like she has to prove herself to you. That's not fair to her." After I hung up, I sat in my kitchen for a while without turning on any lights. Outside the window, the evening traffic moved through the intersection below in its ordinary way. Something behind my sternum had gone hollow. Not grief exactly, not yet, but a precursor to it. The moment just before you understand something you cannot ununderstand. I had still not seen a single medical record. I had been sending $900 a month for 5 years. And when I had asked, gently, for a receipt, my mother had called it unfair. I gave it 2 more weeks. When Petra still hadn't sent anything, not an image, not a PDF, not even a handwritten note, I called the bank. The account she described as her medical holding fund was a joint savings account at a mid-size regional bank. The reason I could call and inquire was technical. When Petra had set the account up, she had listed me as the contributing depositor, and in doing so had left a small legal opening that she almost certainly had not thought about. I wasn't a joint account holder, but as the identified recurring depositor, I had standing to request a receiving account statement history through the bank's financial dispute intake process, a narrow right, not often used, but it existed. I work in billing. I know these things exist. I submitted the request in writing. I explained that I was a documented recurring depositor seeking confirmation that my contributions had been applied as represented. I faxed the form. Yes, faxed, because that is what the bank's intake process still required, on a Thursday morning before I left for work. The statement arrived in my secure message inbox 11 days later. I opened it on my lunch break, sitting at my desk in the coding department, with my sandwich untouched in front of me. I went through it line by line. Every withdrawal, every transfer, every point of exit. I looked for the patterns I'd expect to see if the money was going to hospitals or billing agencies. Irregular amounts, payee names that matched a health system or collection firm, memo lines with account or invoice numbers. There were no irregular amounts. There were no health system payees. There were no invoice numbers. What there was, recurring transfers to a personal account in Petra's name, monthly retail charges at clothing and home goods stores, a dining pattern that suggested regular restaurant meals, a series of charges at a home improvement retailer across a 6-month period that corresponded, I would later understand, with a kitchen renovation she had never mentioned to me.
And a spa.
There was a recurring charge from a day spa that appeared 9 times across the 14 months covered by the statement. I sat with that information for a long time. $54,000. 5 years. 0 medical payments. When I stood up from my desk to go refill my water bottle, I noticed that my hands had gone cold. Not from the office air conditioning, but from something else entirely, something that had relocated itself from the middle of my chest into my fingers. I stood at the water cooler for a moment longer than necessary. The fluorescent light above me hummed steadily. I had a decision to make about what to do next, and I knew that I would not get a second chance to make it correctly. 3. Arrival at the public event. The freeze beat. My cousin Lori's wedding had been planned for 14 months. It was the kind of family event that functions as a centripetal force, the occasion that pulls everyone back to the same geography, the same rental hall, the same folding chairs, regardless of how far apart life has carried them. Lori was on my mother's side, the daughter of my mother's younger brother, and the guest list ran to roughly 90 people. I was invited. So was Petra. So was Grandma Rosa, who had agreed to attend despite her difficulty standing for long periods, which meant she would be seated near the front for most of the reception. I had been planning to attend anyway. After I received the bank statement, I did not change my plans. I bought a dress I had been looking at for a month. I booked a hotel room in Cleveland. I confirmed my attendance. What I also did in the 3 weeks between the statement and the wedding was have a conversation with a woman named Patricia Hendricks, a branch manager at the regional bank, the same branch where the account had been opened. I had requested a meeting through the formal channels. I explained my position as a documented recurring depositor with a dispute. I asked whether a bank representative would be willing to appear at a time and location of my choosing to confirm, in person, the findings of the statement review, in front of witnesses. Mrs. Hendricks said this was an unusual request. I agreed that it was. I explained what I needed and why, and I was very calm about it, and I did not misrepresent a single fact. She consulted with her branch's compliance officer. She called me back 2 days later. She said that given the specific nature of the depositor dispute documentation, and given that the branch had a mobile notary and meeting service already available for estate and estate-adjacent financial matters, there was a process that could accommodate what I was describing. She said she was not in the business of adjudicating family disagreements, but she was in the business of confirming documented financial facts when a depositor had standing to request that confirmation. I said that was exactly what I was asking for. I gave her the date, the address of the reception hall, and the name of the event coordinator. I did not tell my mother. I did not tell Petra. I did not tell anyone except Grandma Rosa, who I called the Tuesday before the wedding and explained everything to carefully from the beginning. When I finished, she was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, "Good. Bring her with a folder." I said Mrs. Hendricks would have a folder. Grandma Rosa said, "Then I will sit near the front, and I will watch." The reception was in a banquet hall attached to a golf club, white linen tablecloths, a DJ setting up near the far wall, the pleasant ambient noise of a family that hadn't been in the same room for a year trying to remember which cousin went where. I arrived early enough to find Grandma Rosa already seated at a round table near the center of the room, upright in her chair with her hands folded on the table in front of her, looking like a woman who had been waiting for this particular moment for some time. I kissed her cheek. She squeezed my hand once, hard, and said nothing. Petra arrived about 20 minutes later with her boyfriend, wearing a pale green dress I recognized from a home goods brand whose charges had appeared multiple times on the bank statement. She saw me across the room, and her expression did something complicated, a brief tightening, a rapid resettlement into warmth.
She waved.
I waved back. My mother arrived shortly after and found me near the gift table. She hugged me and said she was glad I'd come, and she meant it, and I hugged her back and meant it too. Whatever was about to happen in this room was not directed at my mother. She was going to learn something today the same way I had learned it, not because I wanted to hurt her, but because the truth was going to come into the room whether or not anyone invited it. The dinner service had cleared. The speeches were done. Lori's new husband had made a genuinely funny one about her inability to load a dishwasher, and Lori had responded with something touching about her grandmother, and the room was in that warm, loosened state that happens when food and sentiment have been delivered in the right order. I had arranged with the event coordinator for a brief announcement window, framed on the schedule as a short family tribute from Lori's side. The coordinator had a microphone stand near the edge of the dance floor. At just past 8 o'clock, she nodded to me from across the room. I walked to the microphone. I picked up the stand and moved it slightly so I could see both the head table and Petra's table at the same time. I looked out at the room. 87 people in various states of after-dinner ease, Grandma Rosa watching me with her hands still folded, Petra turning in her chair to see what was happening, my mother pausing her conversation with my aunt. I thanked Lori for letting me take a moment. I said I had something I needed to share with the family, something I should have said sooner, and something I was ready to say now. I said, "For 5 years, I sent $900 a month to my sister Petra. She told me it was for medical bills she couldn't pay. I sent it without asking questions because she was my sister, and I loved her, and I believed her." The room went the kind of quiet that has texture to it. I said, 3 weeks ago, a bank representative confirmed in writing, based on 5 years of statement records, that not $1 of those transfers, not one, out of $54,000, went to any medical provider, collection agency, or healthcare-related account. I didn't look at Petra. I looked at the room. I saw my mother's face do something I had no word for, a slow, downward movement of understanding, the expression of a woman receiving information she had not been prepared to hold. I saw Lori's hand go to her mouth. I saw my uncle shift in his chair and look at Petra's table. I looked at Petra then. Just for a moment. Her face had gone completely white. Not pale, white. The kind of absence of color that happens when blood leaves a place it is supposed to be. She opened her mouth and then closed it again. Mrs. Hendricks, whom I had introduced to the event coordinator earlier in the evening as a family associate who would be joining for a brief business matter, walked from the side of the room to the table I had reserved near the center. She was a composed woman in her mid-50s with silver-framed glasses and a burgundy blazer, and she carried a folder the way that professionals carry folders, as if it contained only facts, which it did. She set the folder on the table and stood beside it and said nothing.
She did not need to say anything.
Her presence in that room, with that folder, said everything that needed saying. I set the microphone back in its stand. I walked back to my seat beside Grandma Rosa. Grandma Rosa did not look at me. She looked straight ahead, at the center of the room, and she reached over and placed one hand briefly over mine on the table and then returned it to her own lap. The room did not recover its previous noise level for a very long time. 4. The single reveal plus validation. Mrs. Hendricks did not make a speech. What she did was open the folder and, when Petra's boyfriend asked, with some heat, from across the room, whether this was some kind of stunt, she said in a measured voice that she was a branch manager representing the financial institution that held the account in question, and that the documentation in the folder was a certified statement of account activity over a 60-month period, available for any party, with standing to review. She said she was not there to characterize anyone's behavior or adjudicate a dispute. She was there to confirm, as a neutral institutional representative, that the documented record showed 0 transfers to any medical provider over the full statement period. Petra's boyfriend said there had to be an explanation. Maybe the transfers had been made in cash. Maybe the records were incomplete. Mrs. Hendricks said the statement was comprehensive, that it covered every deposit and withdrawal on the account from opening to the present, and that the account had been closed as of the previous Thursday.
Closed.
That was the part that made Petra stand up from her chair. She stood up quickly, and a water glass shifted and nearly tipped, and the woman sitting beside her put a hand out to steady it. Petra's face had moved from white to something with more color in it, a red that started at the collar of her dress and moved upward. She said, "You can't close that account." "That's my account," I said, from my seat, very quietly. It was established in my name as a depositor-designated medical fund. When I submitted the dispute, the bank's compliance process allows for the account to be closed and the remaining balance remitted to the documented depositor. Mrs. Hendricks can explain the process if you'd like. Mrs. Hendricks confirmed this. She said the balance at closure, $412, the last month's transfer, had been remitted to the depositor of record. She said this was consistent with the account's originating documentation and the bank's depositor dispute resolution policy. Petra said, "That's my money." Mrs. Hendricks said, "The account was designated as a medical holding fund and established under the depositor's name and contribution record. The funds transferred by the depositor are eligible for remittance under dispute resolution. The documentation is available to any party with standing to request it." She said it the way people say things that are already written down somewhere, which they were. My cousin Lori, who had been sitting at the head table with her new husband, both of them very still, said, very quietly, into the silence, "Petra, is this true?" Petra didn't answer. She looked at my mother. My mother was looking at the tablecloth in front of her. Her hands were in her lap. Something in the line of her shoulders had changed, a downward settling, a relinquishing of a position she hadn't known she'd been holding. She didn't look up. My uncle, Lori's father, said, 5 years. Nadia, 5 years, and you never said anything? I said, I believed her. That's what you do when you believe someone. The room held that. Petra's boyfriend put his hand on her arm and said something to her quietly. She shook him off. She looked at me across the room, not with the guilty expression I might have expected, but with something that looked more like calculation, the look of someone deciding which version of events is still available to them. She said, "I was going to pay you back. I always intended to pay you back." I said, "Over 60 months, I never received a single payment toward any of it." Mrs. Hendricks's statement covers the full period. Petra said, "Things were hard. I was struggling. You don't know what my life has been like." I said, "I know what $54,000 is like to not have." That was it. That was the only thing I said that had any edge to it, and I said it quietly enough that only the 4 or 5 people nearest me could have heard it clearly. Grandma Rosa heard it. She said nothing, but the line of her mouth shifted, very slightly, in a direction I recognized. Mrs. Hendricks closed the folder. She thanked Lori for the hospitality, apologized for the interruption to her reception, and walked out of the banquet hall with the same unhurried composure with which she had entered it. She had been in the room for perhaps 11 minutes. The folder stayed on the table. The social and financial cascade / the pleading reversal. I stayed for another 40 minutes. I danced once with Grandma Rosa, who moved slowly and held my hand firmly and said, near my ear in Polish, "You did it right." I said goodbye to Lori, who hugged me for a long time and didn't say anything, and I thought that was probably the right response. I said goodbye to my uncle, who nodded and looked like a man who was going to have a very long drive home. I did not say goodbye to Petra. She had left the banquet hall not long after Mrs. Hendricks, and I didn't know where she went, and I didn't try to find out. I said goodbye to my mother. She was still at her table. She looked smaller than she usually looks, not physically, but in some harder-to-define way, as if she had been taking up more space than she'd realized and had now returned to her actual dimensions. I crouched beside her chair, so we were at eye level. I put my hand over hers. She said, "I didn't know." I said, "I know you didn't." She said, "I should have asked." I said, "I should have asked sooner too." We sat like that for a moment. Then I stood up and kissed her on the temple and went to get my coat. The first call from Petra came 4 days later. I was at work, mid-morning, and I let it go to voicemail. She left a message that ran to 3 minutes and 42 seconds. I know the length because I timed it before I decided not to listen to it in full. The tone in the first 30 seconds was not apologetic. It was the tone of someone who had prepared a case, who had organized their reasoning carefully, who wanted me to understand that the situation was more complicated than I had made it appear. I didn't listen to the rest. I deleted it. My mother called that same evening. I picked up. She said Petra was very upset, and did I think we could all get together and talk it through? I said I wasn't ready for that conversation. My mother said she understood and she did not push, and I was grateful for that. 2 weeks after the wedding, my cousin Lori texted me. She said the family had talked, her parents, my mother, a few of the aunts who'd been in the room, and that the consensus was that what I had done took real courage, and that she was sorry it had happened at her reception, but she didn't think I'd had any other good option. I texted back, "Thank you. I'm sorry it landed on your day." She said, "Don't apologize. You were the one owed an apology." Petra called 3 more times over the following month. The messages shifted in tone as they went from case building to something more subdued, and then, in the last one, to something that sounded genuinely pained. She said she had never meant for it to become what it became. She said she'd started borrowing from the fund for small things when she was between jobs, and it had never been a plan. It had just become a habit she didn't know how to stop. She said she was sorry. She said she wanted to talk. I wrote her a letter, not an email, a letter, because I wanted it to exist on paper, to have weight. I said I wasn't ready to speak, but that I had heard her message, and I was not interested in her suffering either. I said I didn't know what our relationship looked like going forward, and that I needed time to understand that. I said the money was not something I expected to recover, and I was making my peace with that, and that the loss I was more interested in understanding was a different kind. I said, if you ever do want to talk, I need it to start with the truth, and only the truth. Not the version of it that's easiest to live with. I sealed the envelope and mailed it on a Wednesday morning. She hasn't written back yet. It's been 6 weeks. I don't know if she will. My mother and I have spoken several times since the wedding. It is careful in the way that things are careful when a weight has been lifted that you didn't fully acknowledge was there. She said, in one of those calls, that she had always thought I was the stronger one. Not as a compliment, she clarified, but as a shorthand that let her think I needed less. She said she thought she had gotten that wrong. I said, you can be both strong and need something. Those aren't opposites. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, I know. Grandma Rosa called me the Monday after the wedding. She said, you brought a folder. I said Mrs. Hendricks brought the folder.
She said, yes.
But you brought Mrs. Hendricks. I said, you told me to. She made a sound that, from Grandma Rosa, was the equivalent of a laugh. She said, I told you to look. You decided what to do with what you saw. I carry that distinction with me. I am 34 now. I live in the same Columbus apartment, different window view, better radiator, and I am a senior coder at the same hospital network, and I have a budget I review every quarter that is honest about every line. I have a savings account that belongs only to me, with no contributing designees, no joint holders, no one else's name on any part of it. I have not sent a wire transfer to anyone in my family since the afternoon I read the bank statement. I don't know if that will always be true. I know that I am not someone who withholds care from the people I love, and I know that family, complicated as it is still what it is. But I also know, now, in a way I did not know 5 years ago, that love and documentation are not opposites, and that the willingness to ask a question is not the same as distrust. Sometimes the question is the kindest thing you have. The afternoon I got the bank statement, I sat at my desk until the lunch hour ended, and then I worked the rest of the afternoon the way I always work, carefully, accurately, one claim at a time. I did not cry at my desk. I did not call anyone. I ate the sandwich I had left untouched at lunch. I drove home in the ordinary traffic, and I made dinner, and I sat at my kitchen table with a notebook, and I wrote down what I knew and what I needed to do, and then I went to bed. In the morning I called Mrs. Hendricks. That is how I work. That is who I am.
Moral aporism.
Here is what I have come to understand, slowly and without drama. The people who take from you without asking are counting on the fact that you will not ask either. The moment you decide to ask, quietly, plainly, without accusation, just a question, is the moment the accounting becomes possible. I don't think that makes you cold. I think it makes you honest. And honest is something I am going to be from now on, even when it is uncomfortable, even when it costs something, even when the room goes quiet. Rule of 3 recap. That's my story. A recurring transfer, a folder in a woman's hands, and a letter I sealed on a Wednesday morning that is still waiting for a reply. Story-specific audience question. If you were in that banquet hall, if you had given $54,000 over 5 years and you finally had the documentation in your hands, would you have done it the way I did, in front of the family all at once? Or would you have gone to your sister privately first? I've asked myself that question more than once, and I'm honestly still not sure I got it right. Drop your answer in the comments.